We're back with another session in Photoshop CC, the complete guide. If we take a look back at what we've done thus far, in the first week, we covered some essentials. Things like selections, layers, camera raw. Then we headed into week 2. And in week 2, we really talked a lot about adjustments, getting tonal adjustments and color adjustments going, and some great features such as blending modes. Well, now we're heading into week 3. And we're going to start off with filters today, but here you can get a preview of what's coming up for the rest of the week. But today, we're going to be halfway done here. We are halfway done. That was up until, just before this. Now we're moving beyond our halfway point, and we're going to be getting into filters. Let's drop into Photoshop and see what we can learn. We're going to start off by doing something where we stitch a panorama and then fix some distortion that might happen due to stitching that panorama. So what I have here is a series of images. Looks like this. I want to combine these together into a single photograph. But anytime I pan that far across things, and I'm really going from my almost 180-degree view of what I captured there, there's usually going to be some distortion in the end result. So I'm going to select these images, and in order to stitch them together, I would usually choose Tools, Photoshop, Photo Merge. And if I were to do so, it would send me into this dialog. I'm just going to leave it set to Auto, and I'll click OK. So all it's doing is stitching together those photos. Once it's done, I'll end up with one layer for each image, and each of those layers will have a layer mask. And you can see that here in my Layers panel. Now I don't need to work with the individual layers that it delivered, so I'm going to merge those layers together. I want to keep the areas that are empty still being empty, so I'm not going to choose the choice called Flatten Image, because that would fill the empty areas with my background color. Instead, I will choose Merge Visible, which will combine together all those layers that have the eyeballs turned on, and I'll end up with just a single layer. Then I don't need to look at my Layers panel. We'll just look at the image itself, and let's see if there are any issues with it. Well, when I look at these buildings, I notice that the rooftop over here on the left side looks like it's bent. Can you see a bend to that rooftop? And if I were to inspect other areas down in here, I might notice a bend to this rooftop as well. And I would like to correct for that. In order to do so, I first merge those layers together by choosing Layer, Merge Visible. And next what I'll do is go to the Filter menu, and I'm going to choose Adaptive Wide Angle. Now I know we haven't, I don't think, talked about Smart Objects yet, but it would be best if I choose this choice first. That will convert this layer into what's known as a Smart Object. And what that'll allow me to do is the changes I make with the filter will not be permanent. And if I happen to need to come back in and make additional changes, I can easily do so. Whereas if I don't choose this choice first, after I'm done applying the filter, it will be permanent, and it'll be difficult to make further changes in the filter. So I'm going to choose Convert for Smart Filters before I choose the filter I actually want to use, which is called Adaptive Wide Angle. When I'm in Adaptive Wide Angle, I'll get a preview, and I can zoom in and zoom out on this preview using standard keyboard shortcuts, the same ones that work in Photoshop. So if you happen to know of things like Command plus and minus, or Control plus and minus, or Command 0 to fit in window, they all work in here. And the first thing I notice is it seems to have cropped in on the picture a bit. Before, I could see empty space over here on the right side, and this railing-like thing, this is like an edge of a balcony-like area, extended further. And so on the right side, there's a choice called Scale. And if it happened to crop into your image, you could reduce the scale until you can see your whole picture if you need to. And now on the upper left, we have some tools we can use for correcting the picture. The topmost tool is active by default, and we're going to use that for the majority of changes we're going to make. With that tool, I'm supposed to click and drag across any area that should look like a straight line, but is instead currently bent. In order to do that with precision, you would usually need to zoom up on your picture, and there's a quick way to do so. First, on the right side of my screen is an area called Detail. In there, I can see a zoomed up area that is centered on where my mouse is right now. So there, I could get this to line up with the edge of that roof. I'm looking in the detail area. I click my mouse, and then I drag across the roof like this. And once I get to the other side, I again go and look at that little detail area on the right and make sure that I'm still lining up with things. Now, this particular feature, this filter, is aware of how the stitching of my panorama caused distortion. And so when I draw that line, the line actually has a bend to it that matches the bend of the building. And when I let go, watch what happens to the rooftop on the left side. Did you see it straighten? So let's try that again in some other areas. Down here, I believe I see this roof bending a little bit as we go across it. I'll show you a slightly different way of zooming in on your picture because it's not always convenient to be looking at that little detail area. I'm going to move my mouse over here, get close to where I need to be, and then on my keyboard, I'm going to hold down the X key. I'm not sure why they chose X. I would have chosen Z for zoom because I could remember it. But what I do is just hold down every key on your keyboard until it zooms in. And then you remember what key it is. But it's the letter X. As long as you hold the letter X down, you're going to be zoomed in. If you let go of the letter X, it'll zoom you out. So it's like a temporary zoom in. What's nice is it's just a larger area than what you see in that little detail spot. So there, I'm going to get this to line up with the edge of that part of the building. And then I'm going to drag like this until I get to the other end. Try to get it so that line lines up with it. And when I let go, it straightens it. Then I can let go of the letter X to zoom back out and see the rest of the picture. And I just need to decide how many of those areas do I notice that distortion on and need to change. Now this area here to me looks like it curves a little bit as it goes across. So I'll get near one end, I'll hold down the letter X, and I'm going to click right on that edge. Then I could let go of X and move over to the other side so I can see it, and just press X again to zoom up, and get that right on the edge. Let go, and now that's straight. And here, if I want this to not have distortion, I can get right on the edge, come down there. And as long as this line lines up with the edge, meaning that it curves with the same curvature, then this works fine. If it deviates from that edge, then I either need to do it in multiple sections, like only go halfway across and then do the other half separate, or it's just outside of the capabilities of this particular filter. Remember, this filter is called adaptive wide angle. That was the name of it. So I can look at all sorts of other areas in here. Let's try something else. Over here we have a tower. To me, the tower looks like it's leaning a little bit. It just doesn't look like it's quite straight. Does it feel like the top is going a little bit towards the left there? So what I'm going to do there is click on the very tip of the building. I'm going to drag straight down. And I'm going to see if I can figure out where exactly I should place this. I'm going to see if that's the center of the building, maybe if I put it down the center of these sides. Now here's a special feature. If, before I release the mouse button, I hold Shift. Shift means make this perfectly horizontal or perfectly vertical. So when I let go, see if it'll do it. Whoops, hold on. It didn't like me zooming in and out the way I did in that it repositioned the line. Let me try that again, and I'll just do it without zooming back out. Go here, come down to about there, and I'm going to hold Shift. the line changes color when I hold shift to indicate something else is going to happen. And when I do you see how it just rotated that to make it vertical? So I could do that for various parts of these buildings. If there's any parts that should be vertical and are currently not, let's see, on this side of the building I could try to do it if it seems to be bending. Sometimes you have to just kind of guesstimate where it is, but the more precise you are, the better. Click here. I'll drag up to where I think that corner would be. Oh, yeah, somewhere in here. I'm looking at the detail area. I'll hold shift. See how I just straightened that up? So now that's a vertical line. And so this little guy in the middle, I'm not sure if he's straight or not, this thing, but I could click on the very tip of it. I could come down here and just make sure I'm not over like this to the side, not over that to the side, but I'm centered at the base. So if I'm centered at the base of it and I hold shift, it means make that straight. So if it wasn't, it will become perfectly vertical. And it just looks at how close is this already to being perfectly vertical or perfectly horizontal when it figures out what direction it should become. And there is a choice in here called Show Mesh, and that'll show you a grid that kind of shows you, gives you an idea of how it's distorting the picture to get these things to happen. Do you see that kind of a mesh? You can see where it's bending the image. This choice called Show Constraints is going to show you all those little things that you drew. I just turned it off so we don't see them. Therefore, we can see a cleaner version of the picture. Turn Show Constraints back on and you can have that. Also, there is another tool up here that's a polygon tool. So if you have like a rectangular object that looks like it's distorted, you could click on the four corners of it. So you don't have to do the sides all separate. You could do all four at the same time. It works with any polygonal shape, anything that's made out of straight lines. You could just sit there and continually click to do it. I don't know that I have a great example in this picture, but just so you know it is available. And then the other tools that are up there, mainly we have a move tool if I need to move one of the pieces around, a hand tool and a zoom tool for just navigating around the document. When I'm done, I might adjust the scale again to get it close to filling the screen here. Do you see all the empty space that's around it that I don't need? Well, if I bring scale up, it'll bring that up. I'll get it close to filling the screen, maybe somewhere around there. And then I'm just going to click OK. And if I choose Undo, you'll see before and after. And there are many other areas I could have corrected. I probably should have done a little bit in the middle because it did bend a little bit in the middle there. And if I want to make further changes, I can go back up to the filter menu, or actually I don't need to go back up there. I can just go to my layers. Since I turned this into a smart object first, that means the filter that I applied is what's known as a smart filter. It means it's not permanent. It means that if I were to double click right here on this name of the filter, it would send me right back into the filter dialog as if I never left it. And that's what's really nice about converting to a smart object first before you end up applying this. Because now I can come in here and decide, well, maybe this little terrace looks like it's curved. Hopefully it wasn't supposed to be curved. And I can come in here and try to correct for that. And maybe this little edge here looks a little curved. Correct for that. I can do all sorts of areas if need be until I get this to be as nice as I'd like it. Okay? But I click OK and I can return as many times as I want as long as it was on a smart object. Remember what I did right before applying the filter? I went to the filter menu and there was a choice right here called Convert for Smart Filters. That turns it into a smart object. We have an entire separate session about smart objects, so if you haven't seen that session, then you wouldn't know too many details about them quite yet, but I wanted to make sure to mention them before I ended up getting into this particular filter. So let's close that image, and let's experiment with other filters. I want to show you how to turn your picture into a painting without having to know how to paint. If you'd like to see an example, this one is somewhat painterly, different look. Or this one, you'd have to look rather close at to see that it does have little paint strokes within it. So let's see if we can figure out how that can be accomplished. And so I'll open an image. And usually I would turn it into a smart object first, so that the change that I make with the filter is not permanent. Instead, it's like an accessory attached to the layer. It's something I could throw away or double click on to go back in and change the settings on. Then I'm going to choose Filter, Stylize, Oil Paint. Now, Oil Paint is a filter that Adobe added to Photoshop a while ago, not all that long ago, but then they removed it in a version of Photoshop. And then they put it back in later. So depending on what version of Photoshop you have, you may or may not have it available if you haven't updated it to the current version. Choose Oil Paint, and I have a little preview here, but there's also a preview checkbox. If I turn on the preview checkbox, we'll see it on the main image. And I might zoom up there so you can get an idea of it. With Oil Paint, we have just general sliders here to fine-tune our end result, and let's see what some of them do. If I adjust the top slider, you can see how we go from finer little changes in the image to more kind of wavy looking changes. And so I got to decide what I think would look best. Then we can go with cleanliness to determine how much of the detail is kind of reproduced within it. And if I get that up so it's relatively clean, it can look nice. Can also make it for larger strokes or smaller with scale. And then bristle detail. If I bring that down, I can simplify this a bit. Bring it up and it'll be much more finely detailed. Then at the bottom, it thinks that this has a three-dimensional quality to it. It wants to know where should the light source be. That's really going to determine where are little highlights within the image. There's a little circle here you can move around, and you'll find it will change the end result a little bit, like that. But you don't usually have to mess with it too much. And the shine, the higher you bring that up, the more you'll notice those highlights. And in this case, they're becoming way too much. When you're done, you can click OK, and you can see how we've really gotten a stylistic look to this image. But I find that most of the time it looks too generic. It looks like you ran a Photoshop filter. So let me show you how you can make it look the way I think it will make it look much better. Once you go into the filter the first time, think about just the general detail, like the sky and the big expanses of the image, and ignore the fine details, like the detail on the license plate or the detail on the tiny wheel that's over here. Ignore those things to begin with. Then, in the Layer menu, go up to Layer, choose Smart Objects, and choose New Smart Object via Copy. New Smart Object via Copy. That is going to duplicate your layer. You got your duplicate. It also has Oil Paint on it with the exact same things. And in fact, you might be able to get away with just a Command J to duplicate it. I don't know that it's critical that I used the command that I just did. But anyway, the main thing is you want to duplicate the layer. When you duplicate the layer, you have the Oil Paint filter right here. Double click on it to send you back into Oil Paint once again. In this time, instead of looking at the big detail, like the sky and the car itself, start looking at the more small, subtle details. And so now try to optimize the settings for those small details so I can easily see the car windows that are out here, and I can easily see the wheels, and I can see the detail in the tail light possibly. So I might come in here and bring the scale down a bit. I might bring down the stylization a bit. And I'm starting to be able to see the detail in that tire and wheel a little bit more. And a little more in the windows. Maybe I bring up the cleanliness. Or actually, that might be too much. Let's see. But whatever it is, look at the finer details now. Okay. And then click OK. And we're going to have two of these sitting here. And what I want to do to it is now add a layer mask. and paint this version in where we need the fine detail. So when I add my layer mask, I want it to start off as a black mask so that we don't have this version anywhere. So I'll hold down the Option key, I'll click on the layer mask icon at the bottom of my layers panel, so that version disappears. Then I grab my brush, and with a soft edge, let's see what we have here. Yep, with a soft edge, I'm going to see where do I need that additional detail. I'll come over here to these cars. Do you see how they kind of almost blur together? And I'll paint with my soft brush here to bring in that more detailed version where we needed the detail, where those windows were, maybe down here where the wheels were, because it just feels like that deserved more detail because we're getting a little bit too generic with our detail. Maybe over here where the trees are, we needed a little bit more. And sometimes I end up using more than 2 applications. I'll use 3. Over here where the license plate is, I can actually read the license plate now, whereas before it was a generic concept. Can you see that difference where you can read the numbers versus that's the one application? There I can read the numbers. So it would be places like these taillights, I'd paint it in. Okay. Now let me show you an end result where I actually spent a good amount of time doing that. It'll take a while for this image to open because it is quite large. But in this particular case, I probably did at least 3 different applications of the filter, which means 3 different versions. And then I further worked the image to create an end result that I really liked. And so once this image opens, we'll just look at what it was made out of so you get an idea of how using it with more than one application really makes a big difference. All right, let's explore the image a little bit. If we come over here to this chair, do you see the very painterly feeling to it? But we come over here to the flowers, and you can actually see the detail in the petals. If I had this amount of painterliness stuff, this you wouldn't even be able to tell they're flowers because they'd have such generic amount of detail. But then if you come over here to the trailer, do you notice when you get to this little control thing that, I think that's the door holder, it clips into here, you can actually see those little details like the rivets that are here. That's because I used one setting that used really, really fine control, and I masked it in so the areas that need that fine detail are using a different setting than this area that didn't need the fine detail. Make sense? So let's take a look at my layers. This is a complex image because I was actually hired by a company to make this, so you spend a lot of time when you get hired to do stuff. So I'm going to turn off a good amount of what it was made out of, and I will show you. First, let me show you the original picture. There's my original picture. Okay. Then let's see what I ended up doing with it. So I'm going to come in here to the one called trailer siding, and I'm just going to turn off a mask. Okay. Here is the trailer, and you see the painterly look to it. But do you see what it's doing to the fine details like the doorknob? Can you see the lock? No. Can you even see the rivet that's holding this on, or this badge that tells you what the model of the trailer is? No, you can't, and that's why down here I have another version called Fine Details. And do you see how that brings all those details into play? And I also have another area down here at the bottom for flowers, because those flowers, if I didn't know they were flowers, I couldn't tell. So I used it a different amount for that particular area. If I turn that on, you can now see the detail in the flowers. And I also wanted the chair to be very painterly, so I had another version of it for just the chair that really made it jump out. So that makes this look, the document look somewhat complicated, but let's take a look at what I did with the rest of the image just to get it to the end result I liked. I did put a different version of the picture in for the background, and you'll see that kind of filling in here. And on the background, I performed some retouching. So if you look at the background, here is a background retouch. What I'll do to let you see it is I'll revert. we'll open the final version, and then you can see it. But the background, I retouched out a trailer, did the same on the other side, and I applied a texture to it. And you learned how to apply textures when we had the session on blending modes. And so by applying the texture, so it only did it to the background, it made it so that background could stand out from the subject, the trailer itself. And so, in just a moment here, hopefully you will see. Now, so if I darken the background, added that texture, and did some retouching, you can see how it became a much more refined end result. So just because a filter does an effect doesn't mean we're stuck with that effect. We can often duplicate it multiple times by duplicating the layer, applying it various amounts, and masking it. And by doing so, we can get it very refined. So when I come in close, where we need the detail, where the little rivets are and the lock is, we have it. Where we don't need it, we don't have it, and so on. Make sense? And that's where, with this picture, we didn't get to that point, and therefore the rocks down here at the bottom feels exactly the same as the car. I might get more detail in there so that it feels like it just belongs more. Okay, then let's look at a method for bringing out detail in an image. We have many different choices for that. And one of your bonus videos is about sharpening. And that would get into the more professional choices for sharpening. Here I'm looking at the more, I don't know if I'd say creative, but somewhat creative uses of the filters. I'm going to duplicate this layer by typing Command-J, Control-J in Windows. So if you look in my Layers panel, you'll see the duplicate. Then I will end up using a filter that is called High Pass. When I use High Pass, it'll ask me for an amount, and that will control how much I'm going to exaggerate what's happening in the picture. Do you notice when I apply this filter, there's an awful lot of gray in the end result? Well, when we talked about blending modes, I believe we learned that there was an entire category of blending modes that made gray disappear, at least if it was 50% gray. And the gray you see here in the majority of the image is exactly 50% gray. So if I were to click OK, then I could go to the top of my Layers panel and change this to any of the choices in this section, because those are the ones that make 50% gray disappear. I'm going to use the one called Overlay. And now let's see what that's doing to this image. I'll zoom up on it, and I'll turn this layer off and back on again. Do you see the detail popping out? Now I want to get that kind of end result, but I want it to look like this at the time I'm in the filter choosing the amount, because it's really difficult to figure out the amount to use when you're looking at a bunch of gray stuff. So let's try this one more time, and we'll do it in a slightly different way to end up with the same end result, but I think with more convenience. So I will choose Filter, Convert for Smart Filters. That way, when I apply a filter, it's just going to be attached to the layer. You'll see it as a name right below the layer. It's called a Smart Filter then. And I'll come over here and choose Filter, Other, High Pass. Now with High Pass, if you turn it all the way down, all you get is 50% gray. Just solid 50% gray. And that's fine to start with. Click OK. So now if you look in my Layers panel, I did Filter, Other, High Pass. Here's my layer. There's the filter being applied. And do you see this little symbol on the right? I'm going to double click on that symbol. And it will allow me to choose a blending mode. And this means, how does this smart filter affect the layer? And I'm going to set it to a choice called Overlay. How did I get to this? Right after applying a filter to a smart object, I double-clicked right there. And that's what got me in. If I do it again, I can still see it. And I change this to overlay. So now we're seeing that end result that I was hoping for as far as not seeing all the gray stuff. And now I want to be able to choose how much high pass we get, meaning the slider that we had available in high pass, I want to go adjust it. And so now I will simply double click right here on the word high pass. That'll send me right back into the high pass filter, and I can fine tune my result. I can bring this up and say, what does it look like? And instead of seeing gray, I'm seeing our end result. Exactly what I wanted. So if you didn't quite get how I did it, what I did was the first thing is I said convert for smart filters. That was the first one. Second thing was I applied the filter called high pass. And I happen to set it as low as it can go, but it's not critical. You set it as low as you can go. And then after applying high pass, I double-clicked right here in my layers panel. And I told it to use overlay mode. At that point, I have everything set up the way I want to. And the only thing I need to do is actually choose what settings to use with high pass. So to get back into high pass, I double-clicked right there on the words high pass. And now I'm in high pass, and I can fine-tune my settings and decide how high of a setting can I get before this looks too obvious. And how much of that detail do I want to exaggerate? And experiment. It depends on the image. It totally depends on the content of that picture as far as what you can get away with. Some images, you have to use really low settings. Other ones you can get away with quite a bit higher. But if I turn it off and on, this little preview checkbox, can you see the difference of the detail? Then we have a mask. So if this picture contained a person's face, doing high pass sharpening on somebody's face can make them look a lot older because every little change in their face will be exaggerated. So I could click on the mask that's already here. And if I were to paint with black, I'm going to prevent the filter from applying in whatever area I paint. And so I just need to paint with black, and possibly I didn't want it on the sky that's in this building. And if that's the case, I just need to paint where the sky is. And I don't think you'll be able to notice. Well, I can notice. If you look at the edge of this cloud before, after, I'm choosing undo, I can see it changing. You see the difference? And so I could come in there and paint wherever it is I didn't want the sharpening to be applied. Usually that would be faces. But sometimes it's just some areas where you see an odd halo and you just need to tone it down in that particular area. So high pass sharpening is something that's very common in Photoshop. It's just that oftentimes it's not applied in an intelligent way like this, where you use smart filters, so you can easily change it later. You can mask it, and you can see it at the time that you're choosing the settings. Now the same thing can be used with filters like emboss. I think I showed before when we talked about blending modes, how you could duplicate a layer, apply a boss to it, and you could then change the blending mode of that layer. Well, we could do the exact same thing with that. So here, if I want to pull out some of the kind of texture in this trailer that's here, I would convert it to a smart filter. I would choose emboss. It's under stylize. And it's another one of those filters that ends up giving you a lot of gray. And it's always 50% gray. So you double click on the symbol on the right side, same symbol I got to before. And this time I'm going to set it to hard light. Any one of these modes would give me a similar result. I can experiment with which one I think looks best. You also have an opacity, so if it's too strong, you can tone it down. And then you can double click now on the word emboss, and you're back in emboss. And now you're actually seeing the end result instead of all that gray stuff. So it's much easier to figure out what settings you think could be appropriate for the image, because you're in that mode. And where it's too much, which is probably like down on the ground down here, you just need to click on the mask. Make sure its corners are highlighted before you grab your paintbrush tool, and you can paint with black to say, no, I don't want the ground with all that emboss on it. I don't want my sky. I don't think you'll see it much on the sky, but the ground, I noticed it quite a bit. All right, let's create a kind of soft look to an image that adds contrast to it. And we'll also do some things that will give us an antique-y feel color-wise. We'll try both. I'm going to duplicate this image twice. That means I'm going to type Command-J twice. When I do, I'll have a total of 3 versions of the picture up here. I'll turn off the top layer for now and work only on the middle. I'm going to take that middle one and try to get it so it adds contrast to the picture. To add contrast, that means I'll go to one of these contrast modes. When we talked about blending modes, I thought these were the contrast modes. I'll try overlay, and that gives me some of it. Or I can experiment with the others. But I think overlay was looking okay. Then to get this to have a soft, contrasty look, I'm going to come here and blur it. Gaussian blur is the kind of standard adjustable blur filter. If you look at average, blur, blur more, do you notice that they don't have 3 periods after them? 3 periods means it'll ask you for settings. So these blur filters won't ask you for any settings. This one will, and that's the main adjustable blur filter. I don't like its name. There's a guy named Gauss that designed created some of the technology used behind it, and it should just be called adjustable blur. I'm going to use that and bring this up. Get me a softer feeling to the image. And then the top layer I can use if I don't like the color changes that are happening, or if I don't like some of the brightness changes that are happening. What I can do is turn on that top layer, and I can change its blending mode. If I want to use the brightness of that image, I can set it to luminosity. And now we're just getting the color changes that are happening. Or I can set it to color. And now the color in the image should be closer to what we had, but we still have that soft feeling. And that's what I was looking for, is kind of a soft, almost glowy feeling to the image. So this is a blurred image in the middle. It's in overlay mode. And a copy of the original sharp image on top in color mode. Therefore, the colors stay sharp and consistent. They don't become too colorful. If I didn't have that top layer, they'd be too colorful. Then oftentimes this will be a little bit too much, so I can click on the middle layer, because that's where most of the change is happening. If I turn off the middle layer, you'll see there's more of the original picture. Here's our softer look. And if it's too much, I just lower the opacity of the middle layer. Let's try an alternative technique, one that'll give us different looking color. The first thing I'm going to do is an adjustment layer where I'm going to pull out all the color. I'll choose a choice called black and white. And I can fine-tune the image if I want by clicking on it and dragging to brighten or darken various areas. But then I'm going to take the original picture that's underneath, and I'm going to duplicate it. Just type Command-J. I'm going to put it on top. And we're going to tell it to take the colors from the original and apply it to that black and white version that's underneath. And we'll do it using something like overlay mode. And that gives us a different look to our color. If you want to see it compared to the original image, here's the original. It looks more like a normal photo. Here's after. It just has a little bit more of a vintage feeling to it. Once we get into advanced features with layers, I could prevent the dark part of the picture becoming too dark. If you look at this compared to the original, do you see the trees that are there? And when we're done, do you see how dark they get? Well, there's a way to make it so that this doesn't affect the darkest part of the picture so much. And so since this is the layer that's controlling it, I can do it quickly without describing the technology that's behind it. Just know that later on, when we get into advanced layers, you'll learn exactly how this works instead of just using it without a detailed description. With the top layer active, I can limit where that layer shows up and just prevent it from affecting the darkest part of the picture. The way I do it is I double click, not on the name of the layer because that would change the name. I double click out here where it's empty. This comes up, and this slider right here where it says this layer, if I were to bring that over, if I bring it over far enough, you'll find that that layer is disappearing in the dark part of the picture. So do you see the trees kind of coming back to having their detail? The only thing is this creates an abrupt transition, and we need it to be one that is soft. Otherwise, you'll literally see the transition. I can see it right now, right there. Can you see where it's abrupt? To get a smooth transition, you need to hold down Option, Alt and Windows, and pull on one side of the slider to split it in half. The further you split it in half, the more gradual the transition. So I could do that. How did I get to this? I double-clicked not on the name of the layer, but out here beyond the name. When I did, this came up, and I could pull those sides in. We will describe exactly how that feature works in detail in the advanced layers session. So you'll know how it works, so you can use it for all sorts of things. But that brought back some of the detail in my trees. So now this is what I'm calling my antique color look. So here's the original. You see all the vivid colors. Doesn't look like an antique-y feeling to me. And here we're getting a much more muted colors, more interesting look. You can take it further if you want. A lot of antique pictures, old ones, were actually hand-painted the color in. And if you want more of that look, just blur the top layer. And therefore, the transition between the colors will not be crisp, but they'll fade out a little bit more between them. So you could go to Gaussian blur and get a little bit more of the feeling where they are not so crisp. Okay. All right, there's so many filters in Photoshop. Some of them do things that all by themselves don't feel useful. It's when you combine them with things like blending modes, where I take my original picture, I put a copy of it on top, run a filter on it, and then play with blending modes. And that's some of what we've been doing here. It's when you combine more than one feature in Photoshop together that they become much more popular, more useful. And also using them with layer masks so that it doesn't have to affect your whole picture. Now let's do some more straightforward things that you might be able to do on general photographs. Here, I would like to make it look more like I used either a narrow depth of field or just a tilt-shift lens. I don't know if you've ever used a tilt-shift lens before, but with a tilt-shift lens, you can get areas of your image to be very much out of focus easily. Because what happens is the front element of the lens usually is straight up and down when you take a picture. And the depth of field, the depth that things are sharp, is parallel with that. When you tilt the front of the lens, you can get it so it's at an angle that that depth of field is happening, and it makes it so it's easier to get just a slice of focus. And you don't have to know about the lens kind of thing, because if you don't own one, then it doesn't matter. But I just want to make it so this area here is sharp, and much of the rest of the image is not. And so first I'd usually convert for smart filters, because then whatever I apply is not permanent. And then I can come down here and choose Blur Gallery. Here we have all sorts of different ways of blurring our pictures. We have spin blur, which can be useful if you have a car that was not in motion and you want it to look as if it was. You can spin the wheels. We have path blur, where you can draw a path, and that's going to blur things in the direction of a path. So if you have something that is supposed to look like it's quickly going around a corner, well, you could blur, instead of blurring in a straight line or anything, you could make it bend around a corner as it blurs. We're going to choose something called tilt shift. With tilt shift, we get these little lines on top of our picture, and I can click and move this around. I'm just clicking in the center here. And I'm going to move this so that center portion is on the area of the picture that I would like to keep. And then we have a little wheel in the middle that I can move around. And if I'm moving that wheel around, all it's doing is changing a setting on the right side of my screen called blur. It's just a more convenient way of doing it than having to move your mouse to the right side of your screen. So when I use this, the area between the middle two lines will remain sharp. Then the area between that line and the dotted line is where it's going to fade out. And then anything beyond the dotted line is going to get the full blur. And I can come in here and pull on these lines to determine how abruptly should it fade out, or should it fade out more over a larger area. And if I want to get this just to have a really narrow area that's sharp, I can pull these lines closer together. And you get the other line at the top with how quickly should it fade out there. So just remember, between the two main lines, it stays sharp. Between this line and the next is where it slowly fades out, getting blurrier and blurrier and blurrier as it goes across. And once you get to the dashed line, anything beyond that gets the full blur. Yes, question? Is there a way to turn the sides on and off? To do them on and off, yes, I'm assuming I can type Command H. Yes. Command H means hide. That's Control H in Windows, because it would be a little distracting to have them always sitting there. And so I can do that. The one issue, though, is when you blur something, if the picture had any noise in it or any grain in it, the blurred areas won't have that noise or grain in it, and therefore can look rather artificial, because if you had a true tilt-shift lens and you tilted it to give you a narrow range of focus, you're still going to have the noise, still going to have the grain in those blurry areas. So you're going to find that down here we have some options for adding grain to our picture. So I can bring up this, and on this particular image, I'm not going to notice it much because this is a low resolution picture. If it was a large, high resolution picture, and when I zoomed up on it, I noticed in the sharp areas that I can see some grain to it, I would want to zoom up into the blurry areas and bring up the amount slider until we seem to have a similar amount of grain within it, and therefore it won't look as computer generated. And that's why you also have some other settings to try to match the grain in the rest of the picture. We have size, roughness, and so on to try to match it. But this is tilt shift. And this whole thing is known as the blur gallery, meaning that it's combining more than one filter over here. Do you remember when I went to the menu called Blur Gallery? It gave me a side menu of many choices. Well, here are those other choices, and I could expand those to apply another one of those blurs at the same time, one that spins or does other things. So it is the same kind of interface for each of the filters. You'll find a similar thing where there'll be a little ring in the middle that you can turn to control the blurring, and you always have the noise control at the bottom. And what this will usually do is it will make it look as if things look like a model. Have you ever seen a picture of like a downtown city, or oftentimes they do it with videos, and you see a video of like a port city where you see little boats come in and everything, but it looks like a model, and you don't know why, that it doesn't look real. And that's because usually you cannot get a narrow depth of field like this with a wide-angle lens where you can see an entire city. The way that you get a narrow range of focus or of sharpness is you magnify something. And that means you put a telephoto lens on where you only can see a small area of the scene. Then it's easy to get the background to go out of focus. Or you get really close to something. And that's why your brain thinks that what it is looks like a model, because the only time you're used to seeing a wide range of things with very narrow focus is when it's really close to your head or under a microscope. And so it it fools your brain into thinking that something often looks like a little model. And if you ever see it in real video where they didn't use Photoshop to produce it, they had a tilt shift lens where the front of the lens could be tilted. There are all sorts of other things we can do with Photoshop's filters. What I want to do, though, is give you a little bit of extra info. That is, some filters in Photoshop can create detail out of nothing. Those are these particular filters. What I mean by that is you can have a document that's just full of white. And many filters wouldn't give you any result whatsoever if you had a document full of no detail whatsoever, like Emboss, for instance. Just finds the detail in your image. It puts little highlights and shadows on it. Well, in a white document, there is no detail, right? If I use a filter called Find Edges, it draws black lines around the edges of objects. If you have a document full of white, it won't find any detail, won't be able to do anything. But these specific filters can create detail out of nothing. So what does that mean? That means that we could start with a brand new document. And in that brand new document, we can run one of those filters, one of which was called clouds. And we get something. Then we could experiment with other filters and create our own textures. So instead of having to, here I'll do clouds, and then I'll do a motion blur. And then in the end, I'll emboss. But we can create our own textures, so we don't have to always photograph them. Let's see what kind of texture I can get. Oftentimes, if you do a subtle texture, you'll have to adjust it with levels or curves afterwards. Or if I do add noise will add specks. And then I motion blur one direction, because there's a filter called motion blur, and it has a direction to it. I motion blur the other direction, and then emboss. It'll look like fabric. It looks like you wove them together. But if you use one of the filters that is listed in this list, you'll start with some sort of content, even though you started with an empty document. Then you can distort that content as much as you want. When you're completely done, emboss it. And by doing so, you can create kind of an unlimited variety of textures. Some other filters that are special, these filters. These particular filters, just so you know, they look at and incorporate your foreground or background colors in their end results. So here, if you see the letter B, it means that you only uses your background color. If you see the letter F, it means foreground. And if you see both, it's going to incorporate both. So one of the choices in here is clouds, and I can see that it uses both my foreground and background colors. So if you ever use the clouds filter and it doesn't produce what you expect, look at your foreground and background color, because it's affecting the way that particular filter works. Okay? But I just wanted to give you that kind of insight, because if you don't know it, then you can get confused about using those filters where you're just like, you know, I don't know why every time I use this filter it's giving me a different result, and that's because every time you use the filter, your foreground and background color is slightly different. Okay? The other thing that's nice about these foreground and background colors is when you combine filters with blending modes, then this is really useful, because there are certain blending modes where white disappears, like darken mode and multiply mode. So why not set your foreground color to white and apply one of these filters? Then wherever the white is applied, you can make it disappear by using one of those modes. Or in the contrast modes, 50% gray goes away. So set your foreground and background color to 50% gray, and you know it will be incorporated within these particular filters. So those are areas that you could make disappear. So experiment with that to see what you can come up with. But here we have just looked at just scratching the surface of what you can do with filters. And there's so much more you could do. We could do an entire month-long class on what to do with filters. I just picked some of the common things that I do with filters. Tomorrow, we're going to get into advanced masking. Advanced masking I find to be pretty exciting, because this is where we can learn how to isolate and possibly remove the background on things like glass, fire, hair, really complex trees and other things. Things that would usually take hours and hours to do, we can do oftentimes in minutes once we learn about the features related to advanced masking. But before we get to that, why don't you head over to Facebook? On Facebook, we got our Facebook group, and if you're not in it yet, here is the website you need to go to get in. You just need to ask to be added, and it might take us a day to notice that you've asked and approve you. But once you get there, this is where you can ask all your questions. This is where you can post your pictures you've been working on, ask for feedback from the other people that are taking the class. And if you want to find me on social media, here are the various areas you can go to find me. But this has been another session in Photoshop CC, the complete guide. Hope to see you next time.